In 1796, George Washington was more than a president. He was the unassailable hero who had won a revolution. Many assumed he would rule for life, but he chose to do something truly radical. He walked away from power. Before returning home, he left a final message for the American people. It was not delivered from a grand stage with roaring crowds. It was quietly printed in a newspaper for everyone to read. This farewell letter was not a list of accomplishments. It was a series of stark warnings. Washington saw clear threats on the horizon that could destroy his new country. What dangers did he foresee? And how did this single letter become one of the most prophetic documents in history? The story we often imagine is of a revered president stepping down to thunderous applause. The reality was much messier. By 1796, Washington was not a triumphant hero. He was an exhausted statesman battered by political combat. He was desperate for an escape. In his own words, he felt wearied to death. He longed for retirement, like a reprieved criminal whose execution has been cancelled. What had worn him down? The brutal, relentless nature of the new partisan press. This was a new kind of political warfare fought with ink and paper, and it was vicious. Newspapers like Philip Frenel's National Gazette and the Aurora didn't just question his policies. They attacked his very character with a viciousness that shocked him to his core. These weren't polite critiques. They were poison pens. He was labeled the American Caesar and accused of plotting a monarchy. He was called an incompetent general and a fraudulent president. One paper claimed he was a traitor during the Revolution. Another commentator wrote that his retirement should be a national jubilee, a day of celebration for the country being free of his influence. Every attack chipped away at his spirit. His desire to return to Mount Vernon became an obsession. He wasn't just a politician finishing a term. He was a farmer who longed to walk his own fields again. He longed to be far from the bitter political theater of Philadelphia. He famously told a friend he would rather be on his farm than be made emperor of the world. The contrast was stark. And this is the essential key to understanding his farewell message. It wasn't born from quiet reflection. It was forged in the fire of his own disillusionment. He decided to warn the nation about political parties because he had personally felt their baneful effects. The forces that drained his will to lead were the same ones he feared would destroy the Republic. His final address was no victory lap. It was a diagnosis of the disease he saw infecting American politics, written by its first and most prominent victim. The partisan press that tormented Washington was just the symptom. The disease was a nation already splitting at the seams. The famous unity of the Revolution was a fading memory. By the 1790s, America was dividing into two hostile political camps. The architects of this division were two giants serving in Washington's own cabinet. On one side stood the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, leading the Federalists. They envisioned a powerful America, driven by commerce and industry. To get there, they needed a strong central government and a national bank to stabilize the economy. Most importantly, they wanted a practical relationship with Great Britain, the world's economic engine. For the Federalists, order and national strength were everything. On the other side stood the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, alongside his ally James Madison. They led the Democratic Republicans. They looked at Hamilton's plans and saw the beginnings of a new monarchy. They saw an American aristocracy. They championed the rights of states and idealized a nation of independent farmers. Their hearts were with revolutionary France, which they believed was fighting for liberty. This was not a friendly debate. It was an ideological Cold War that paralyzed the government. The fight over creating a national bank was bitter. Jefferson argued it was completely unconstitutional. But the true political firestorm ignited over foreign policy, where loyalties to Britain or France defined everything. The flashpoint was the Jay Treaty of 1794. It was a controversial agreement designed to prevent another war with Britain. To Jefferson's supporters, it was an outrageous betrayal of their ally, France. They saw it as a pathetic submission to their former colonial rulers. Mobs took to the streets, burning effigies of the treaty's negotiator. For Federalists, it was a simple matter of pragmatism. War with Britain would be economic suicide. The debate was absolutely toxic, consuming the nation. When it came time to fund the treaty in the Senate, the vote was an astonishingly close 11-10. A single vote could have shattered the government's policy. This was the fractured, angry, and deeply divided country that Washington was trying to lead. His farewell address was not a warning about a hypothetical future. It was a desperate plea to the present. The fiery political battles of 1796 were not the beginning of Washington's desire to escape. They were just the final straw. The truth is, he had already tried to quit once before. The farewell address we know was not a new idea. It was Plan B. At the end of his first term in 1792, Washington was already feeling the strain of the presidency. He was homesick for his farm and convinced he had done his duty. He was fully prepared to pack his bags and head back to Mount Vernon for good. He was so serious about it that he began preparing a final message to the nation. The man he asked to help him write it might be surprising. It was not his close collaborator Alexander Hamilton. It was James Madison, the very same man who was becoming a leader of the political opposition alongside Thomas Jefferson. At this earlier stage, their relationship was still salvageable, and Washington trusted Madison's wisdom. Madison drafted a thoughtful message for him. It was a call for Americans to cherish their union above all else. It stressed the importance of respecting the Constitution and the rule of law. The core themes that would echo so powerfully in 1796 were already there, written down on paper 4 years earlier. The answer is, why did he not deliver it? The world outside America simply would not let him. The French Revolution was spiraling into a terrifying new phase, and tensions with Great Britain were rising to a breaking point. The country was a ship heading into a storm, and Washington was the only captain everyone trusted. In a rare moment of unity, both Hamilton and Jefferson pleaded with him to stay. They knew that without him at the helm, their own political factions might tear the young republic apart before it had a chance to survive. Reluctantly, Washington agreed to serve a second term. The draft of his farewell address was quietly filed away, a powerful idea waiting for its moment to arrive. 4 years of brutal political infighting had changed the landscape since Washington first planned his exit. In 1796, he needed more than just a thoughtful farewell. He needed a powerful, unassailable closing argument. For that, he turned to his sharpest and most trusted collaborator, Alexander Hamilton. Their working relationship was legendary, forged in the heat of the Revolutionary War. Hamilton, the brilliant and ambitious aide, had a unique talent for grasping Washington's thoughts. He could translate them into powerful, precise language. He was more than a secretary. He was an extension of Washington's own will. This process was not ghostwriting as we understand it today. It was a deep intellectual partnership. Washington was the architect of the ideas. He provided Hamilton with his core principles and personal notes on the dangers facing the nation. He also included the original draft James Madison had written years earlier as a starting point. The mission was clear. They had to take these foundational concepts and build a masterpiece. Hamilton was the master craftsman. He organized Washington's thoughts into a clear, logical structure. He sharpened every argument and polished every sentence. The rhetorical fire that makes the address so powerful was largely Hamilton's contribution. We know this because the documents survive. The manuscripts show a fascinating dance between the two men. We can see Hamilton's elegant, flowing script laying out a paragraph. Then we see Washington's larger, firmer handwriting making changes. He crossed out a word here or inserted a new phrase there. These edits are crucial. They prove who was ultimately in charge. Washington was the final editor, ensuring the message was precisely his own. While Hamilton provided much of the eloquence, the soul of the document was pure Washington. The warnings, the principles, and the heartfelt plea for unity came directly from the president. The farewell address is a unique synthesis. It is Washington's wisdom, channeled through Hamilton's genius. With the final text polished and ready, a crucial question remained. How would Washington deliver this monumental message to the nation? A grand farewell speech before Congress seems like the obvious choice. Imagine the scene, the emotion, the historical weight of the moment. But Washington chose to do the exact opposite. He never spoke these words aloud to the public. He understood the world he was living in all too well. A speech could be misheard. Its meaning could be twisted by the very partisan newspapers he detested. An oral performance was fleeting, subject to the passions of the moment. He wanted his final message to be permanent, precise, and personal. He decided his address would be a letter, a direct communication from him to every citizen who could read. He wanted people to sit with his words in their own homes. He wanted them to reflect on his arguments without the filter of a cheering or jeering crowd. This was a document meant for careful study, not for applause. The chosen venue was not a grand hall, but the pages of a newspaper. Specifically, David C. Claypool's American Daily Advertiser, a Philadelphia paper known for its neutrality. This was a deliberate choice to avoid the hyper-partisan outlets that had tormented him. On September 19, 1796, with no ceremony, the address simply appeared. Subscribers opened their morning paper to find this dense, multi-page text from the president. Other newspapers across the country quickly began reprinting it. The message spread not like a shockwave, but like a slow, deliberate tide. This decision was a masterstroke of political communication. By publishing his address, Washington ensured his warnings would echo far beyond his own lifetime. He was not giving a speech for his contemporaries. He was writing a foundational text for future generations of Americans. A letter designed to be read and reread for centuries. On the morning of September 19, 1796, a Philadelphia merchant sat down with his coffee and David C. Claypool's newspaper. He likely expected the usual news of shipping and politics, but what he found instead was something entirely different. There was no grand headline or special announcement. There was just a letter, simply addressed to the people of the United States. It was an intimidating sight, consuming 4 full pages of the newspaper with a dense ocean of words. But the signature at the bottom made everyone stop and read, George Washington. The news of the president's final message spread through the city like a spark, becoming the only thing anyone could talk about. The impact was immediate and profound. Within days, newspapers from Boston to Charleston were reprinting the entire text, eager to share it with their own readers. Printers quickly turned it into pamphlets, which sold out on street corners. For a nation without modern media, this was the equivalent of a national broadcast reaching every corner of the Republic. The public reaction was overwhelmingly one of reverence. Many felt they were receiving a final testament from the father of his country, a man who had guided them for 2 decades. It was treated as a sacred text, a guide for the nation's future. People read it aloud in taverns and discussed its warnings in their homes. But this was still the deeply divided America that had exhausted him, and the reverence was not universal. While many saw a patriarch's wisdom, his political opponents saw a clever parting shot. The Democratic-Republican press immediately began their dissection. They argued that beneath the calls for unity, the address was nothing more than a defense of Hamilton's Federalist policies. In their eyes, it was not a father's advice. It was a party manifesto dressed in the disguise of patriotic farewell. The letter meant to calm political fevers had, for some, only raised the temperature. Beyond the immediate reaction, the true power of the address lay in its specific warnings. At the very heart of the text, Washington placed his most urgent and detailed prophecy. He warned against what he called the baneful effects of the spirit of party. This was not a gentle suggestion to simply get along. It was a dire prediction about a political disease. He saw it as a force that could distract from public business, weaken the government, and ultimately unravel the entire American experiment. For Washington, parties were not a sign of healthy debate. They were a republic's worst enemy. He argued they create ill-founded jealousies and false alarms. They exploit regional differences and turn citizens against one another for purely political gain. He predicted a future where loyalty to a party would become more important than loyalty to the nation itself. The primary goal of politics would no longer be the common good. It would simply become about winning at any cost. This obsession with winning would lead to a horrifying cycle. He called it the alternate domination of one faction over another. Politics would become a zero-sum game of revenge, not of governance. When one party wins an election, it does not govern for all. Instead, it uses its new power to punish the other side. This constant political warfare, he warned, would lead to chaos and misery, paralyzing the government itself. And this is where his warning becomes truly chilling. What was his ultimate fear? Washington predicted that the people, exhausted by the endless conflict, would eventually look for a strong leader to save them. They would become willing to trade their precious liberty for the simple promise of security and order. The constant chaos of partisan fighting would make them desperate for anyone who could impose stability. The chief of some prevailing faction, he wrote, would then rise to power. This individual would build a personal empire on the ruins of public liberty. For Washington, the spirit of party would in the end open the door for a dictator. The danger of political parties was not just about Americans fighting each other. Washington saw a much greater threat looming. He drew a direct line from internal division to foreign corruption. His logic was brutally simple. A political party, desperate for an advantage over its domestic rival, would be tempted to seek help from abroad. This, he wrote, opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. It essentially creates an auction where the country's interests are sold to the highest bidder. Foreign governments could easily exploit these divisions. They could fund a friendly newspaper or whisper promises of power to a faction's leaders. This was not a theoretical fear for Washington. He had seen it happen with his own eyes. The nation was already split between Federalists who favored Britain and Democratic Republicans who adored France. A perfect, terrifying example of this danger arrived in 1793. A French diplomat named Edmond Charles Genet landed in the United States and immediately began causing trouble. He completely ignored diplomatic protocol. Genet acted like a revolutionary agent on American soil. He tried to recruit American citizens to attack British and Spanish territories, directly undermining Washington's official policy of neutrality. He became a rock star for the pro-French Democratic Republicans. They celebrated him in the streets, even as he was actively trying to hijack American foreign policy. Washington was furious. He saw a foreign agent using a domestic political party to drag his country into a war it did not want. The affair was a perfect illustration of his warning made real. This experience is baked directly into the farewell address. When Washington warns that a party's passion can override its patriotism, he is thinking of the Genet affair. He is warning that a faction's attachment to another nation can become so strong that it betrays its own country. The ultimate result is that the nation becomes, in his stark words, a slave to the will of another. Washington's warning about foreign influence was just one half of the equation. The other half was perhaps his most famous piece of advice. It was a clear, pragmatic rule for a young nation in a dangerous world. His message was simple: to steer clear of permanent alliances. This was not a call for America to hide from the world. It was a brilliant strategic argument based on one undeniable fact: geography. The United States was separated from the ancient conflicts of Europe by a vast ocean. Washington saw this distance as America's greatest asset. It seemed illogical for a country with its own destiny to get dragged into Europe's endless quarrels over power and territory. He argued that Europe had a set of interests that were fundamentally different from America's. Tying the nation's fate to a European power through a permanent treaty would be like anchoring a new ship to a very old, very chaotic storm. It would mean sacrificing American independence for the sake of someone else's war. This warning had a very specific target. Everyone reading the address in 1796 knew he was talking about the old Treaty of Alliance with France. This treaty had been essential for winning the Revolution, but now it felt like an obligation that could drag America into France's revolutionary wars against the rest of Europe. Many Democratic Republicans felt a deep loyalty to France. They believed America was bound by honor to help its old ally. Washington saw it differently. He saw a trap that would destroy the nation before it had a chance to grow strong. This was not a new position for him. The farewell address was the grand philosophical statement of a policy he had already put into practice. It was the logical conclusion of his earlier proclamation of neutrality. He was making it clear that neutrality was not just a temporary tactic. It was the cornerstone of American security. The nation's true policy was to be the master of its own fate. A small aside: if you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. This often gets misunderstood. Washington's advice to avoid permanent alliances was not a call for America to lock its doors and become a hermit kingdom. He was a practical man, a farmer and a businessman. He knew a nation could not survive, let alone prosper, by cutting itself off from the world. Instead, he drew a sharp, crucial distinction between two types of foreign relationships. There were political ties, and there were commercial ones. His great rule of conduct, as he put it, was simple. The nation should have as little political connection as possible with other countries, while extending its commercial relations to everyone. The logic was brilliantly straightforward. Political alliances drag you into other people's fights. They come with baggage, obligations, and the constant risk of being drawn into wars that have nothing to do with your own interests. Commercial relationships, on the other hand, build wealth and create connections without the messy political strings attached. Think of it this way: Washington wanted America to be the friendly merchant who sells wheat and cotton to everyone in the neighborhood. He did not want America to be the guy who has to show up with a musket every time his neighbors get into an argument over a garden fence. This entire strategy was not born from a place of fear. It was a strategy to buy time. The United States in 1796 was a young, fragile nation. It needed decades of peace to grow, to build its economy, to populate its vast lands, and to forge a truly national identity. Getting tangled in Europe's ancient power games would only stunt that growth. He argued that if the country could just stay out of trouble for a generation or two, it would become so strong that it would no longer need to depend on any other nation for its security. It would be powerful enough to choose its own destiny on its own terms. This was not a policy of isolation. It was the ultimate policy of independence. A nation open for business with the world, but politically indebted to no one. Beyond the dangers of political parties and foreign wars, Washington saw another crack forming in the nation's foundation. This threat was not ideological but geographical. He looked at a map of his own country and saw the potential for it to shatter into pieces. He issued a powerful warning against what we now call sectionalism. This was the fear that citizens would stop thinking of themselves as Americans first. They would instead identify as Northerners, Southerners, or Westerners. This loyalty to a region over the nation was, in his view, a poison that would destroy the Union from within. To counter this, he made a practical, almost business-like case for unity. He explained how each part of the country depended on the others to prosper. The industrial North, with its maritime power, provided the ships and markets for the agricultural South. The South, in turn, supplied the raw materials that fueled the North's economy, and the developing West relied on the protection and established trade routes of the Atlantic states to survive and grow. They were not rivals, he argued. They were indispensable partners in a single, great American enterprise. He insisted that the whole was far stronger, more secure, and more prosperous than the sum of its parts. Any attempt to separate them was based on a lie. But he knew this economic logic would not be enough. He saved his sharpest criticism for the politicians who would exploit these differences for their own gain. He warned of designing men who would try to create the impression that regional interests were opposed. They would invent grievances and stoke resentment simply to win an election. This, he declared, was a betrayal, a direct attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest. It was a chillingly accurate prophecy. For the next 6 decades, this is precisely what happened. Political careers were built on magnifying the tensions between North and South over slavery and economic policy. The geographical divisions Washington feared became a chasm, leading directly to the Civil War. After warning against political feuds, foreign wars, and regional fractures, Washington turned his attention to a different kind of enemy. This one was quieter, more insidious. It was the nation's growing credit card bill. His advice on this front was direct and sounded a lot like something a fiscally responsible father would say. He urged the nation to cherish public credit. He saw it as a vital source of strength in emergencies. It was the country's ability to borrow money when its survival was on the line. Like any good credit line, he warned it should be used sparingly. This was not an abstract concern. According to the records of the time, the national debt in 1796 stood at roughly $83 million. To them, this was a staggering sum, a legacy of the Revolutionary War. Washington, deeply influenced by Alexander Hamilton's economic vision, believed this debt had to be managed with extreme care. His great fear was the accumulation of new debt during times of peace. He saw this as a profound weakness. Why borrow for today's expenses when you could pay your own way? It was a recipe for disaster. It meant that when a real crisis hit, like another war, the nation would already be financially exhausted and unable to defend itself properly. But for Washington, this was more than just a matter of good accounting. It was a question of morality. He argued that racking up debt in peacetime was an ungenerous act. It meant passing the bill for your own comfort and convenience onto your children and grandchildren. Each generation, he believed, had a duty to pay its own way. He called for a disciplined approach. Pay off war debts as quickly as possible. Maintain a balanced budget. Avoid the temptation of spending money the nation did not have. For Washington, a strong republic was not just one that was united and independent. It was one that was solvent. Financial responsibility was another name for freedom. If there was one thing George Washington knew with absolute certainty, it was how to lead an army. He was the commander who had faced down the greatest military power on earth and won. This personal history makes his next piece of advice all the more stunning and deeply credible. He urged the nation to guard against the dangers of what he called overgrown military establishments. This wasn't a throwaway line. It was a central fear for the entire revolutionary generation, a lesson learned the hard way. They vividly remembered living under the watch of British redcoats quartered in their own cities. To them, a large, permanent, professional army was not a protector of the people. It was a classic tool for a government to oppress them, a direct threat to freedom. Of course, Washington was no pacifist. He was a stone-cold pragmatist who knew the country had to defend its borders. His proposed solution was a careful compromise designed to balance security with liberty. He advocated for a small, professional army to handle immediate threats. This force would be supplemented by a well-regulated militia composed of ordinary citizens, ready to serve when needed. The goal was simple but crucial. The nation must have a military sufficient for its defense, but never large enough to threaten the civilian government it was sworn to protect. This fear was not some abstract philosophical point. It was rooted in very recent memory. In 1794, Washington himself had personally led a federalized army of nearly 13,000 men into western Pennsylvania. His mission was to crush the Whiskey Rebellion, a tax protest that had turned violent. The operation was a success. He proved that the federal government would decisively enforce its laws. But the event surely left a deep and unsettling impression on him. He had just commanded a massive military force, not against a foreign enemy, but against his own citizens. In his hands, it was a tool to preserve the Union, but he understood the terrible potential. What could such a force become in the hands of a less scrupulous leader? He saw the temptation a powerful army presents to any ruler. The very institution designed to secure the Republic could, if it grew too large and too powerful, become the instrument of its complete destruction. Perhaps the most powerful part of the farewell address was not a word at all. It was the action behind it. After all his warnings about ambition and the temptations of power, Washington did something that spoke louder than any sentence he could write. He walked away. In a world still dominated by kings and emperors who ruled for life, this was a revolutionary act. He could have easily stayed in office. Many Americans expected him to. Instead, by voluntarily stepping down after 2 terms, he sent a clear message. The American president was not a monarch. He was a citizen, a public servant who would serve his time and then return power to the people. This single act established a powerful, unwritten rule. It became known as the 2-term precedent. It wasn't a law. It was a tradition, a standard set by the first and most respected leader of the nation. And it was a tradition that held firm. For over 140 years, every president who followed honored this example, serving no more than 8 years. Tradition was a cornerstone of American democracy, a constant reminder that power was temporary, but it was not unbreakable. In 1940, with the world plunging into a catastrophic war, Franklin D. Roosevelt did what no one had done before. He ran for, and won, a 3rd term. He would go on to win a 4th. Roosevelt's decision, made during a moment of global crisis, sparked a national debate. After his death, the country decided that Washington's unwritten rule was too important to be left to tradition alone. It needed to be law. This led directly to the ratification of the 22nd Amendment in 1951. The amendment formally limited future presidents to 2 terms in office. In the end, Washington's final action was so profound that the nation chose to write it directly into the Constitution. His example became the permanent law of the land. Washington's final action set a precedent for future presidents, but his final words set the course for the entire nation's foreign policy. For more than a century, his warning to steer clear of permanent alliances was not just advice. It was the undisputed gospel of American diplomacy. This principle guided the country through its vulnerable early decades. It allowed the young nation to focus on its own growth without being dragged into Europe's constant wars. The first great expression of this policy came in 1823. President James Monroe looked at the newly independent nations of Latin America and saw a threat. He worried that European powers might try to reclaim their old colonies. His response was the Monroe Doctrine. It was a bold declaration to the world. The doctrine stated that the Western Hemisphere was now officially off-limits to any new European colonization. It was essentially Washington's advice, but with a bouncer posted at the door of the Americas. It was a clear signal that the U.S. would not meddle in European affairs. It also showed that America expected Europe to return the favor. Throughout the 19th century, this became the default American position. Whenever a crisis erupted in Europe, presidents and politicians would pull out their copy of the farewell address. They used it to justify a policy of determined non-intervention. This was the era of what many called isolationism. It was a policy born directly from Washington's parting words. This powerful tradition would not be broken until the world itself changed beyond recognition. The do not disturb sign that America had hung on its door was finally torn down by the cataclysm of World War I in 1917. America's entry into that conflict was the first definitive break with Washington's ghost. The final severing came decades later. This was the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a permanent military alliance that would have been unimaginable to the Founding Father. For over 120 years, his word was law, but the world had grown too small for his advice to hold forever. Washington's address is not some dusty document locked away in an archive, reserved only for historians. It is a living ritual, a vibrant tradition that brings his final words directly into the modern corridors of power. Each year, on or near his birthday, the United States Senate stops all of its usual legislative business. The chamber falls completely silent in a rare moment of nonpartisan ceremony and reflection. One senator, specially chosen for the honor, stands to read Washington's complete message aloud to their colleagues. They do not offer a quick summary or read selected highlights. They deliver the entire text. This powerful tradition was born from one of the nation's darkest moments in history. The Senate first held this solemn reading in 1862, when the country was tearing itself apart during the Civil War. At that desperate time, the Union seemed on the very verge of total collapse. The decision to read the address was an urgent plea to remember the founders' dire warnings against sectionalism. Those exact warnings were tragically coming true on bloody battlefields from Virginia to Tennessee. The reading was a powerful reminder of the cherished unity the nation was fighting so hard to preserve. The ceremony proved so impactful that the Senate repeated it in the years that followed. Then, in 1896, it became an official annual tradition that continues without fail to this very day. The procedure itself is simple, yet deeply symbolic. To underscore the message of unity over party, senators from the two major political parties alternate taking on the honor each year. For nearly an hour, the voice of the first president replaces the political noise and partisan arguments of our modern world. The tradition forces a rare and necessary moment of collective reflection among the senators. It gives the nation's leaders a chance to once again hear the founding principles upon which their republic was built. They are reminded of the timeless warnings about party loyalty and foreign entanglements. They are also reminded of the fragile nature of liberty itself. This solemn ritual ensures that, at least once a year, Washington's ghost still walks the halls of power, his advice echoing for a new generation. In the end, the farewell address was more than a list of warnings. It was Washington's final gift to the nation he had spent his life creating. Think of it as the ultimate instruction manual for a complex and dangerous piece of machinery, the American Republic. He was the chief engineer, and these were his notes on how to keep it from breaking down. Every piece of advice in the text was drawn from his own hard-won experience. He had personally commanded a fragile, divided army during the Revolution. He had navigated the treacherous currents of international diplomacy, and he had felt the bitter sting of partisan hatred from his own cabinet and in the press. He wasn't writing about abstract theories. He was mapping the very real dangers he had personally faced. The address is a profound statement on the difficult requirements of self-governance. It argues that a constitution and a set of laws are not enough to guarantee freedom. A republic also requires a certain kind of citizen. It needs people who are willing to prioritize national unity over regional loyalty, who value the common good more than party victory, and who remain vigilant against the slow creep of tyranny. This roadmap for survival was not always followed. Future generations would entangle the nation in the very alliances he cautioned against. The spirit of party he so feared would become the central organizing principle of American politics, and the sectional divisions he warned about would eventually explode into civil war. His predictions were often ignored, but they were rarely wrong. Ultimately, the farewell address is a timeless and deeply personal appeal. It is the plea of a leader who had seen the best and worst of human nature. He asked his fellow citizens to rise above their petty quarrels and to cherish the immense value of your national union. It was a call for principled leadership and a reminder that liberty is not a birthright. It is a fragile inheritance that must be earned and defended by every generation. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into George Washington's farewell address. We hope you found this exploration of his final warnings and timeless advice as fascinating as we did. His words echo through history, helping us understand our own world just a little better. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and sharing it with others who appreciate history. Your support is truly what allows us to continue bringing these incredible stories to life. For more content on pivotal moments from the past, please subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.